Well, I have good news and a good story, and I have good news. So believe that there's good news. Um, there once was a family, a highly dysfunctional family that was filled with jealousy and hatred and violence and rage. There once was a family, a highly dysfunctional family that was filled with apathetic and cowardly men who had evil intentions, who let jealousies blossom into the worst kinds of actions. There once was a family, a highly dysfunctional family that God called to his glory, a family that was chosen by God to be the means to save an entire world. Not chosen because they were good or righteous or holy, but chosen because God was good and righteous and holy, because he wanted them, because he wanted to display his majesty amidst their brokenness. Praise the Lord. This is good news that God can use a highly dysfunctional family to accomplish his purpose. Perhaps he can even use us. So welcome to Joseph's life, a highly dysfunctional family, and let's see what we can learn from it. We're trying to cover about 20 chapters in Genesis, and I'm going to hit them very quickly and give you the highlights. Let's look at just look at the screen there. I think Romans 15:4 will be up there, but it says, "For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope." So we're going to take a closer look at the life of Joseph and see what kind of encouragement and hope it can bring to us. We'll see how Joseph had a remarkable view of God's long-term perspective, and how his situations and circumstances, which were sometimes awful, how it didn't shake his faith in God, it actually grew his faith over time. It moved him from being born into wealth and privilege to being a slave, and then becoming a prince in the end. And so I hope that you'll be able to relate to some of Joseph's surrounding circumstances, maybe some of them, and that it will give you some hope to recognize that the sovereign God who preserved Joseph through the midst of just terrible things is the same God that loves us and knows us, and is willing to preserve us in the midst of difficulties as well. Pray with me for a moment, please. Lord, may your message go forth clearly today and not be hindered in any way by the deficiencies of this messenger. Thank you that we can come openly to worship you, to speak well of you, and pray your spirit would be here and that would move us. In Jesus' name, amen. So a brief overview of the life of Joseph. If you've been reading along and journeying through the Bible, you would have covered this a few weeks ago. But birth to age 17, which I would call the approaching storm. And the stage is being set in this time frame for a tumultuous life. His family was in transition. They were out in what's like modern day Iraq right now. And that's where he grew up, is quite a few years there. And there were low rumblings of pain and discontentment building in the family. There was all kinds of jealousy and hatred and really bad things going on. And that was his childhood, birth to 17. 17 picks up quite a bit in the story in Genesis 37. And I call this period the raging storm period. And as Joseph entered into young adulthood, the storm hit full force, and he was enslaved by his own brothers, and then he was placed in prison, and the storm raged all around him until he was about 30. And then the latter part of his life, 30 to about 110 years old, is when he died. And so he had about 80 years of sunshine and blessing, mostly sunshine and blessing. And he prospered under God's blessing in a way that was remarkable. And so although he had the perfect opportunity to exact revenge upon his brothers for what they had done to him, instead he chose blessing instead of cursing. And blessing is beautiful. Oh, cursing is not. And so let's see what we can learn from that. So last week, Matt told us some portions of the story of Jacob and Laban. Jacob is Joseph's daddy, right? So Jacob and Laban. Jacob moved away and was going to find a wife, and he fell in love with this girl named Rachel, and wanted to marry her. And then the father-in-law tricked him, and he ended up marrying the wrong sister. Remember that? All this mess and swirl. You got to read it. If you haven't read it recently, go read it. It's a mess. This is where he grew up, where Joseph grew up. And so Jacob was an irresponsible father in many ways. You know what Matt talked to us last week about this name being deceiver is the root word. And he did a whole lot of deceiving. And except for a few brief interludes of goodness, he really didn't have a lot of good things going on, except God was gracious to him. And so Jacob's marriages were plagued with instability. So Jacob started right out the bat with 2 wives. He was going to marry Rachel, and he gets to the wedding, and I don't know how this happened, but he marries the wrong woman. How do you do that? I mean, seriously. If y'all have an idea about that, I would love to know that. How do you marry the wrong person? You wake up the next morning and say, "Who are you?" I mean, how did they even keep Rachel away from the wedding? Where was she? I don't know. All right. Well, he was tricked. He wakes up this day. It's the wrong one. So 1 week later, he has another wife, the one that he wanted. Okay. So he already has trouble. He has 2 wives. Oh my goodness. But double trouble. He's got 2 sisters for wives. And unfortunately, he loved one. Genesis 29 says he loved one, which means he didn't really love the other one. He was tricked. And so there was a great contention that grew up and resulted from this new beginning. And it resulted in childbearing competition. And Leah, the one that he didn't wish to marry but was tricked in marrying, ended up having 7 children. She had 6 boys and a girl named Dinah. Rachel couldn't have any children, not at first at least. And so Rachel got the brilliant idea to add another concubine woman to the scenario. She had a couple, and then Leah, who was his first wife of a week, you know, the anniversary dates of 1 week apart, you know, don't forget the one, forget the other. Oh my goodness. Then add another woman to the mix, and she has some babies, and then Rachel has a son, and his name is Joseph. Okay, so that's like welcome to the world, Joseph. This is your family. And so my eraser's still up there. So we got one husband, and we've got 2 wives and 2 concubines. And what's that equal? Trouble. Oh my gosh. All right. It equals 1 father in 1 house. Ready? 1 father plus how many mothers? Oh, okay. And, my son thinks he has it bad because he's got 2 older sisters and a mother. So all right. And then at this time, there were 11 sons. Benjamin is born later. And how many daughters at this time that we know about? 1 daughter. Welcome. This is the family. Here we go. That looks like a great combination for like strife and jealousy and hatred and anger and secrecy and lust and deceit and murder and all kinds of wonderful things, right? Yeah, and so not very good. And eventually Jacob took his family, all of these people, and left the really bad situation that he had there in the Iraq region of Haran, left out of there and went toward Israel and was on his way to moving back to Canaan. So on their way to move back to Canaan, there was tragedy struck 4 different times. And this is Genesis 34. On their way back, they stopped at a town. All these people are traveling, and they stopped in a town called Shechem. And Dinah was raped. The sister was raped. And Jacob didn't do anything about it. The father didn't do anything about it. And so a couple of Dinah's full brothers went and tricked some of the men and then murdered all of them. Like the whole town gone. And then took the wives and the children and the plunder and their houses, and really like not a good, So interestingly, Jacob didn't do anything until the news started to spread in the surrounding area that his name was getting blackened. And so Genesis 34:30 says, then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have brought trouble on me by making me odious among the inhabitants of the land, and they will gather together against me and attack me, and I shall be destroyed, I and my household. You hear the sort of central me in that? Yeah, that's Joseph's daddy. So the family moved on, and a second tragedy struck, the death of a mama. And it was which mama? Rachel. Rachel is the one that he loved. Okay, so Rachel died, who was Joseph's mother, died giving birth to another son, Benjamin, and there you've got 12 sons. And so that was a terrible thing, and they had to bury her along the way. And then we've got another tragedy that's right next to it, where Reuben, the oldest male, decides to have sex with one of his father's concubines. That's a bad deal, right? Joseph had a great family. And interesting, Jacob was aware that this happened. Jacob, the husband, and the father was aware that this happened. He didn't appear to do anything about it until it shows up at the end of the blessing when he's an old man and dying, and he doesn't give that son as much as maybe he would have given because his son took something. So when Jacob finally reached Canaan, a fourth tragedy struck. Do you remember what happened? Joseph's granddaddy died, Isaac. Isaac died. And so that was the trip. Hey, we're traveling all the way across, and we didn't fly. We didn't have a motorhome. We walked the whole way. And these four things happened, and now they're in the promised land. And that's an uplifting story. And are y'all ready to go home now? It's not a good story so far, right? We're not encouraged. No. Well, I tell you all the background detail to give you an idea of where Joseph came from, and that despite his upbringing, something remarkable happened to him, even in the midst of his own tragedy and circumstance that we haven't talked about yet. And because he had faith in the midst of difficulty, he was used by God to do something quite remarkable. So don't forget that all of this is there, but I want to remember, sorry about that. Can't lock those things. I want, as we think about this story, the rest of this story, I want you to think about the upper story that exists, and there's a lower story. And I always write in capital letters, almost always, and I'm sorry to my third grade teacher, Miss Register, but I just like it better. So upper story and lower story. She was my fifth grade teacher too. That's a weird thing. Thought it was weird. She was a nice lady. So there's an upper story and a lower story. The lower story, we all have this. This is where we live and breathe. This is, my knee hurts now because I'm older. This is, I've got stress at work, having children, helping people with homework and algebra. And I haven't done algebra like in 30 years. And I got to remember that. My mom is sick and the car doesn't work, and all the stresses of life is the lower story. And we live here, but we're not called to see the world only here. We're called to look up to the upper story. And the upper story is where God is just making great things happen. It's God's story. It's where he fulfills his promise to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. It's where Jesus comes from. It's where the end, you get to the end, and Revelation is here, and there the King of Glory comes. Right? That's the upper story. And while we live in the lower story, we should never forget the upper story. And for some reason, it had to be God's hand on him. Joseph had a keen awareness of the upper story, and he didn't let the situations and circumstances, the best we can tell, get him down. And so he's one biblical character who does an exceptional job of paying attention to the upper story. Sorry. Let y'all look at that for a second. So the heart of the story, Genesis 37. You can look at Genesis 37, the opening there, he's 17 years old. Joseph is 17, and at this time, he's got 10 older brothers who do not like him. He's got a younger brother that's not yet born, but he's got 10 older brothers who hate him, and there's three main reasons that I can see from the text that they don't like him. The first one's favoritism. His daddy likes him better, and like it's obvious that his daddy likes him better, and he's not shy, and we shouldn't have favorites, right? But Jacob had favorites with his wives. Started out that way. It's just Genesis 37, 3 and 4 says, now Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a very colored tunic. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. You ever had anybody like that you couldn't speak on friendly terms? It's just not a fun thing, and this is his home. The second reason why they didn't like him is that he brought bad reports to the father. And so Genesis 37:2 says, and Joseph brought back a bad report to them about their father. I can imagine the younger sibling tattling on the older sibling. Anybody have younger siblings? Anybody have older siblings that tattled on you? Younger siblings that tattled? You remember that? You remember when you got in trouble and you stayed out late and you thought that you made it in time and your parents weren't home because they were out on date later than you were, but you made it back home on time because they weren't there, but you were late. And then your sister says, oh, he was late last night. And then you get grounded, that kind of stuff. That's Joseph. I think Joseph brought bad reports. He was favored. He brought bad reports back to his parents. That didn't endear them. And then Joseph had dreams. He had these dreams about his older brothers and his mom and dad going and bowing down before him, which was a little pretentious to them. And a lower story application is if you have even dreams of grandeur from the Lord, it's maybe better to keep them to yourself and don't go tell your brothers and sisters about that. Or if you do, you need to do it in a really careful way because he wasn't ready for what happened. He wasn't prepared for the reaction that they were going to have. So Jacob sends Joseph out to the field to get a report about your brothers. Again, here he comes again. What's he going to say to daddy this time? Genesis 37, 18 through 20. When they saw him, when the brothers saw Joseph at a distance, before he became close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. Then they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we will say, a wild beast devoured him. Then let's see what will become of his dreams. Nice. Okay. So eventually they didn't kill him. They just decided to sell him into slavery, which also wasn't very good. And just as an aside to pay attention to something that's happening here. Remember God's promise to Abraham? He was going to make him a great nation, sands on the seashore, multitude of peoples. From what family? The whole mess of the family. With this family. God can do great things from this family. Can he do good things in your family? Do y'all have all that mess happen in your family? Probably not. Probably not. We have laws against that now. But he did great things out of the brokenness of this. He can do probably great things out of our brokenness as well. So let's not forget about that. I want to give a quick warning to fathers in here. Jacob appears to be too passive as a daddy, and it came crashing down on him. Where was he when Dinah was raped? Where was he when his sons went and slaughtered the whole town of Shechem? He was worried about his name more than anything. And then his family was torn apart by favoritism that he actively practiced and nurtured. He didn't do a good job. And so Jacob sowed these seeds in his family, and bitterness and rage grew. And Hosea 8:7 says, for they sow the wind and they reap the whirlwind. And that's what ended up happening in this family. And so fathers, our examples, how we live our lives directly impacts our families. And so we ought to pay attention to that and be careful. All right, back to the story. So meanwhile, Joseph's sold into slavery. He gets sold in, he goes to Egypt. He gets purchased by a man named Potiphar, Genesis 39:1. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of the Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. And so this very tragic thing happens to Joseph. The response was not proportionate to the action. Brother tattletales on you, and you don't like him very much, and so let's sell him into slavery. It's a bad deal. But what's interesting is that Genesis 39:2 says something that is encouraging to me. It says the Lord was with Joseph so that he became a successful man. What do you mean? He was sold into slavery and the Lord was with Joseph. It's the very next verse. So in the midst of a very tragic lower story, the Lord was with Joseph? Yeah. In the midst of your own tragic story, is the Lord with you? Yes. That's the present application for us. That even when tragic things happen to us and tragic things happen around us, God is still with us. God is still for us. When you are unjustly accused or sued and it's really not your fault, and when your name is slandered, and when you lose your job, and when your health fails and a tragedy happens to you, God is still with you. God is still for you. And we need to hear that. I need to hear that, because the lower story is exhausting, isn't it? Are y'all get tired sometimes down here and all this stuff? Yeah, I get tired too. And that's why I have to look up and say, God is good. God is great. God is kind. God is wise. I need him. So God prospered Joseph, and not just Joseph, but this man named Potiphar. He blessed what Joseph was working on, and because Joseph was working for Potiphar, Potiphar was blessed as well. And so Joseph was eventually put in charge of the whole household of Potiphar, and things really started to look up for him. But then another bomb drops, and the bomb drops in the form of a bombshell, and it was Potiphar's wife. Genesis 39:6 says, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. It came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, 'Lie with me.' So she made many advances toward him in order to get him to sleep with her, and he turned her down time and time again. And the reason he gave is in Genesis 39:9. 'My master has held nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?' So because Joseph spurned her advances in a rage, she set him up, and Potiphar ended up throwing him in prison, but didn't kill him, which is, I find interesting. Didn't kill him. Of course, there's the upper story going on here too as well. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in jail. And the next says, read that out loud, that bold part. Read that out loud. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph again. He was with Joseph again in his lower story. The upper story and the lower story, it's like they exist here together. They did. And the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The Lord was with him. God's favor was with him. He rose in power in the jail and became the chief of the jail, even though he was a prisoner. And which would have been nice, because someone's getting paid not to do a job. He's probably going out playing golf or whatever they played back there in the day. And, the chief jailer who was supposed to be doing the job, and Joseph's handling the jail. It's great. One thing that God did for Joseph in prison was the ability to interpret dreams. Remember, dreams got him in trouble. Maybe his mouth about the dreams got him in trouble back when he was younger. Well, he could interpret dreams. And Matt mentioned this a little bit last week, that he was in prison. And then there was the baker and the cupbearer, some officials of Pharaoh that were there, and they had some dreams. And Joseph said, "Hey, you're going to die. And hey, you're going to be okay." And then that happened. And the guy that he said, "You're going to be okay," the cupbearer, he said, "Hey, tell Pharaoh about me." And here we got, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Now it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. So after Joseph had risen in prison and did a good job and all those kinds of things, and interpreted this dream that was true, and this guy got killed, and interpreted this dream that was true, and this guy got restored to Pharaoh, and he said, "Don't forget about me." And he did. And 2 years later, he's still in prison, and then Pharaoh has a dream. And then the cupbearer says, "Hey, I know a guy. Forgot about that. Call him." And so Joseph comes. Joseph gets brought out from the jail, and you can imagine, think about this. You have the next one, Genesis 41. Just imagine, see Joseph, he's hairy, he's dirty, he's in a prison dungeon. Yeah. and then he has to get cleaned up. The Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph, and they hurriedly brought him out because Pharaoh said, come. They're like, oh no, but he's like nasty. So hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon, where he shaved himself and changed his clothes and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I've heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. I'm not the one who can interpret your dream, but I serve a God who can. It's really pretty good that he did that. And he interpreted the dream for Pharaoh. It was mentioned last week, 7 years of bumper crops and then 7 years of famine. And so Genesis 41:39, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, you shall be over my house. Only in the throne will I be greater than you. So if we pause on this for a minute, we'll see that that from 17 years old, he was a slave, and until 30 years old. And when I remember how to do the math, and I subtract those two, and it's 13 years, 13 over 30. That's 43% of Joseph's life has been pretty bad. He didn't have freedom, right? Now, his growing up years weren't good anyway. But then good things start to happen for him, and he gets released from prison. And now he gets a job to work for Pharaoh. But that's a long time. And he was 30 years old when he entered the service of the Pharaoh. And what Joseph said would happen comes true. There's 7 years of bumper crops, and then and so he gets underway in saving these crops so people can live during the years when the famine hits. So they prepare for the famine, and other nations hear that there's grain to purchase in Egypt, and because this disaster was in that whole area. So people start coming from all their surrounding areas, and they go to Egypt, and they buy grain there. And it also impacted Joseph's family back in Canaan, and they also come. So Jacob sends his sons down to Egypt to buy food. And the story tells us that when Joseph's brothers make their way down to Egypt, Joseph is now 39 years old. Okay, so it's 9 years after this. That's a long time. 9 years, so it's 2 years into the famine already, and people are out of food. And then we see the dreams come true. The dreams that kind of, part of the reason that got them there in the first place, the dreams come true. Genesis 42:6. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land, and he was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. They didn't recognize him, but Joseph did recognize them. And would he get his revenge? I mean, here's the point. We've reached, what is it, the climax of the story and what's going to happen. And he didn't destroy them. He didn't curse them. He ends up forgiving them. And why is that? And it's got to be, in my mind, is that he understood the upper story. And we know that because we're going to read that in just a second. And Matt has already read that as well, which he meant for evil, God meant for good. God can take broken, wicked, evil things and make good things out of it. Were you broken, wicked, evil? Yeah. Can he make good things out of you? Yeah. He can do great things, and Joseph understood the upper story, and so he was willing to be gracious and to forgive. And so Joseph captured the upper story. Genesis 45:3-8. It's long, but it's good. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, please come closer to me. And they came closer, and he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now, do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in these land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord over all his household and ruler over the land of Egypt. That's crazy did you see that? I mean, they did do that. They did sell him. They got paid 30 pieces. They got paid a slave's price. They did evil to him. But he doesn't hold a grudge. He forgives them. because he sees God's hand at work to do something remarkable with his life. Later on, Joseph says this famous line, and he says, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. What you did in the lower story, the terrible things you did in the lower story that you intended for evil, God took that and he made good things come from it, because that's the kind of God he is. And this shows us that God can use us. He can use us in our lower stories and in the trouble and the difficulty and all of this stuff. And sometimes we bring the problems on ourselves. He can still work through that and make a grand plan and do something remarkable up here in the upper story if we pay attention and we look up. So he can either use, his purposes will be accomplished. His upper story that's told and that we're watching and reading, that's why we're doing the journeying through the Bible, so we can see Jesus everywhere. From Genesis 1 all the way to the end, we can see Jesus. And there's this grand story happening. And he can use the evil and he can use good, but his plan will not be thwarted. And it's not. And if he uses our evil, if we do evil, and he can use our evil, but we get curses upon ourselves and we hurt other people, but his plan's not going to be thwarted. Or he can use our good if we choose to. And we get blessed and people get blessed and his name is known as well. His plan won't be thwarted. And Joseph understood that. And God revealed his plan of redemption through a broken and messed up family. This is not like your epitome. This is like the desperate blank of, how all the television shows. This is a bad situation. And God takes the bad situation and the bad family full of terrible things and is able to build something beautiful and remarkable. Who comes from that? He chose from this family to make a king, right? A king like no other came. A king that is a fierce king that is loving and that's wise. A king that is kind. A king that existed for all time comes in the form down here in our lower story as a little baby, comes all the way from here as a little baby through this family. In order for God to honor his commitment to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, he had to preserve them through a difficult time. And so the nation of Israel had to survive for the king of Israel to come. And so without a plan, they would have perished in the famine. But God went ahead of them and preserved them. And so Joseph was put in a position of power, and he was able to provide food for his family. But not only that, and this is an important piece to remember, his whole family comes and settles in Egypt. And they're given fertile land. Pharaoh gives them fertile land and allows them to tend their flocks, and they grow and they prosper there. And if they had stayed in Canaan at this time, it's very likely they would have intermarried with the Canaanites. And this, as God was trying to make himself known among this family that was very dysfunctional, they had a lot of work to do to grow in their godliness, if you will. And if they had stayed in Canaan, they would have intermarried and probably had idolatrous worship, and things would have been thwarted, likely. And so the Egyptians had a phobia about shepherds, and so they didn't mess with the shepherds. They didn't mess with Joseph's family, and they didn't intermarry with them. And so they were preserved in a foreign land in a way that probably would have been difficult to happen if they had stayed there. Now, as you read the story, I think, doesn't Joseph have a right to be angry with God? I mean, so much of what happens in the lower story, so much of what happens in Job that we read, right, in January, is this lower story that it wasn't Job's fault, and great suffering and heartache and hardship. Do we have a right to be angry with God? Well, I think we exist for him. God's a preserving God. God could have made Joseph's second command a different way. But for those who've been believers for a while, he's a preserving God, isn't he? Doesn't he walk us through hardship to refine us? I don't want to get in a refiner's fire. It burns, it's hot, it's hard. But he uses that for some reason to refine us and to make us better. And it's very likely that Joseph needed more time. He may not have been ready. He may not have become the man he needed to become without the hardship. And so God is a preserving God. Psalm 23:4 says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. He doesn't preserve us from it. He preserves us through it, right? But we have to walk in that dark, deep place. And Jesus says in John 16:33, he tells us, so don't expect it to be any different, okay? The world tells us different things. Are you ready for this? Life is hard. Life is hard. Don't expect it to be easy. Don't listen to the world. The world tells us it's easy. It's not easy. It's hard. And Jesus says right here, in this life, you will have trouble. So expect it to come. But take heart, because I've overcome the world. So God prepares us for challenges ahead by using trials and difficulties to refine us, to strengthen us, to make us better, to strengthen our faith and trust in him. So at that time, whenever we do get the blessing and we do rise to second in command in a godless nation, we can give glory to God because we've been giving glory to him all the way through, right? Psalm 90 verse 1 says, a psalm of Moses. Lord, you have been our dwelling place for all generations. Why? Because the upper story has been going on since before we walked the earth, before there was ever the Genesis 1. Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. In that chaos in Genesis 1, there's a story going on there, and God was, and God is, and he will be, and we get a part to play. And don't forget, in the hardness of life and the difficulty and the death and the sadness and the pain and all of that stuff, that we have to look up to the upper story. We're called to do that. The Lord has been our dwelling place for all generations. God is eternal. He's from everlasting to everlasting. He was the safe dwelling place of Adam and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and you and me and our children and our grandchildren. He is a safe and dwelling place for 1,000 generations hence. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And that's very good news, but it's a conditional promise. You know, one needs to be a Christian for this promise to apply. A person needs to recognize their sin and what Matt's talking about before, and confess his sin, her sin, and that separates her from God, and accept his grace and mercy. But you can't just be a Christian also for this to apply. Romans 8:28 applies to those who are living their lower stories in light of their upper story. So this is the kind of person who reads her scriptures and recognize that God is up to something great in my life. She wakes up each morning and she lives her life in such a way as not to get lost into the details and the pain and the suffering and the heartache, but she's willing to look and know who God is and live her life for him. As we conclude here, there's a wonderful book, and I'm a reader and I've read a lot of books, but this is absolutely within my top 10 best books ever that I've ever read. And we've been reading it with our children since they were wee little. If you don't have it, you got to buy it. I don't care if you're 50 years old, buy this book and read it. It's beautiful. And Jesus is on every page. And it's a Jesus Storybook Bible. It's wonderful. Listen to the story as read here. When they saw it was Joseph, his brothers were afraid. They had wronged Joseph. They had sinned and they knew it. Now Joseph would certainly punish them. But Joseph looked at his brothers and his eyes filled with tears. Even though his brothers had hurt him and hated him and wanted him dead, in spite of everything, he couldn't stop loving them. His heart, which they had broken, filled up with love, and Joseph forgave them. Joseph threw his arms around them. Don't be afraid. Behind what you were doing, underneath everything that was happening, God was doing something good. God was making everything right again. Joseph didn't punish them. He rescued them. He brought God's special family to live safely with him in Egypt. One day, God would send another prince, a young prince whose heart would break. Like Joseph, he would leave his home and his father. His brothers would hate him and want him dead. He would be sold for pieces of silver. He would be punished, even though he had done nothing wrong. But God would use everything that happened to this young prince, even the bad things, to do something good, to forgive the sins of the world. Pray with me.